Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, everyone. Are you here? Welcome to the first panel discussion. My name is Leila de Kogan-Chin. I'm the head of the CRPD Ratification and Implementation Unit at the Department of Justice and Equality in Ireland. And I'd like to start by thanking the Presidency for their excellent work in prioritising the issue of implementation of the Convention and giving us the opportunity to share our experiences and achievements and also our perspectives on the challenges we face. I'm particularly pleased to be here because today's discussion is of great interest and will be very useful in the context of Ireland's position with regard to the Convention. Unlike most of the member states represented here today, Ireland is one of only 3 member states who has not yet ratified the Convention. I can assure you that this is no reflection on the level of commitment to achieving the full realisation of the rights of people with disabilities. Ireland's proud of its domestic human rights record, and we're dedicated to continuous improvement where equality, human and fundamental rights are concerned. However, we have a dualist legal system under which only the national parliament can make legislation. So as a result, Ireland cannot ratify any international treaties until it's in a position to fully meet all that treaty's requirements. We need to have all our building blocks in place before we can ratify CRPD. While this is a challenge, it's also an opportunity. We have the benefit of learning from the experiences of other member states who've already ratified, seeing what has worked well with regard to implementation, along with the difficulties and unforeseen challenges which have arisen. We've had to look at the Convention and measure its articles against our entire body of national laws to see what we need to change or introduce to meet the requirements. Approaching this all in one go means that we can propose a raft of legislative measures to ensure practical and meaningful realisation of the Convention's principles in a coherent and a cohesive way. For us, therefore, ratification is the end of the preparation and implementation phase, not the beginning. So far, we've identified 4 main areas where legislative change will be needed to enable ratification. First of all, capacity legislation. I'm sure this is an issue for many member states. The Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Bill was published in 2013. It's at an advanced stage of the legislative process now, and it should be enacted by the end of the year. It'll provide a series of options to support people with decision-making capacity difficulties to kind of make decisions and exercise their rights in line with the principles of the Convention. The second main area for legislative change is mental health legislation. A review of the Mental Health Act has recently been completed. The expert group's report was published just in March of this year, and the bulk of the 165 recommendations made relate to changes in mental health legislation. So the Department of Health is working on the general scheme of a bill to reflect these measures in revised law. Sexual offences legislation is another issue that we have to tackle to meet the requirements. A general scheme of a sexual offences bill was published in November last year. This will reform the law concerning sexual offences against vulnerable persons. The bill's a priority and it's currently being drafted with a view to publication in this parliamentary session. And the final category where we need to amend in order to ratify the Convention, it covers all other necessary miscellaneous amendments, including many where we have to update outmoded, archaic and really unsuitable language in older legislation. Within this final category, we also have to tackle the issue of reasonable accommodation, and I'd be very interested to see what other member states have done with this. Our Supreme Court made a ruling in 1996 that it's unconstitutional to impose an obligation on employers to provide reasonable accommodation where it exceeds a nominal cost. As you know, the Convention requires a higher standard, that of disproportionate cost. Now, it's difficult to quantify in cash terms in an abstract way what the difference between these two standards could be. However, this is a constitutional impediment which we have to solve before we can ratify. The EU Employment Equality Directive, which as EU law takes precedence over our constitution, that solved the problem insofar as employment is concerned. the proposed EU anti-discrimination directive would certainly solve this issue for us for goods and services, but we're currently looking at all different options to overcome this barrier. So that's what Ireland needs to do. We're working with all government departments to agree a roadmap to ratification, which will set out all the measures we need to take to overcome all the outstanding barriers. And given the amount of legislative change needed, we're looking at a timescale of around 18 months to carry out all these measures. So I know we've a lot to cover here in a very limited time, so let me quickly outline the format of today's panel discussion. Following on from this morning's ministerial meeting, we'll be starting with 3 short 5-minute statements from 3 member states, Estonia, Sweden and Hungary. I'm sure we'll learn a lot from their experiences and their insights. We'll then have 3 longer presentations of up to about 20 minutes from distinguished speakers representing the UN, the Academic Network of European Disability Experts, and from Eurocities and the City of Lisbon. After that, hopefully we'll have time to hear a lot from yourselves in what I'm certain will be a very engaging and thought-provoking discussion. So without taking up any more of your time, I'm going to hand you over to Mr. Markus Tsahkna, the Minister for Social Security in Estonia, and please try and stick to your times. I really don't want to have to use the bell. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will stick on the time. And I'm honored to take part of this high-level conference, such an important topic as human rights. And I would like to give some notes about Estonian government plans. The background is like this, that Estonia has entered statistically a situation that we are losing more people from the labor market than entering to. So it means that all persons, all the people who are living in Estonia, they are mostly important for us. So Estonian newly formed government has put disability issues highly on the agenda. Estonia is about to undergo a comprehensive workability reform, which entails encouraging and enabling disabled persons to be more integrated to the labor market. An important cornerstone of the reform are active labor market services and social welfare services to support the employment possibilities of people with reduced workability. With the help of structural funds, an extensive catalogue of supportive services has been developed. In addition to already existing services, new services will be added, like occupational rehabilitation, protected working, sheltered employment, transportation support, mobile counseling, and experience-based counseling. Furthermore, we have planned measures to support family members with care burden in finding work and working. To reduce the care burden, various services will be offered, including interval care, alarm button service, and telecare, which allows to combine welfare and health services. I believe that investments in and empowerment of people with disabilities is important not only for the person, but also for the economic development of the state. Coming now to the state of play with implementation of the convention. Estonia ratified the convention 3 years ago. Today we are about to establish a framework for independent monitoring mechanism. As regards measures that are most needed to implement the convention, from social policy perspective, I point out the following. It's important to facilitate inclusive education and employment according to persons' individual needs and capabilities. Our coalition agreement has set focus on promoting a smooth transition of young disabled people from education system to the labor market. The precondition of the successful implementation of the convention is the effective and timely engagement of the stakeholders. Coming now to the last question. Despite the fact that Estonia was strongly affected by the crisis and has had cuts in public expenditures, we prioritized supportive measures for the vulnerable groups. For example, we maintained the provision of labor market and social welfare services at the pre-crisis level in order to avoid people falling into long-term unemployment and deeper poverty. Estonia has made a clear commitment to continue to develop a society which proceeds from the principles of human dignity and human rights for all, and view disabled people first and foremost as the subject of rights with the goal of independent living and full inclusion in all areas of social life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Our next speaker, we will be giving a presentation. It's the political advisor to the Minister for Children, the Elderly and Gender Equality in Sweden, Mr. Guy Lööf.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. I would like to start by thanking the Latvian presidency warmly for the invitation to this conference and for giving us the opportunity to share experience of Swedish disability policy. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its mission is highly prioritized by the Swedish government. I'm convinced that we will have a very fruitful debate here. Since autumn 2014, we have in Sweden a feministic government. In practice, that means that in every issue we discuss, in every measure we address, there will be a gender perspective. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities went into force in Sweden for 2009. Before this, a comprehensive review of legislation and application of the law was carried out. The government's national strategy for implementation of disability policy is based on the Convention in order to promote the rights of persons with disabilities. The strategy contains clear and concrete objectives and means of measuring programs, as well as structure for monitoring, follow-up, and evaluation. The overall objectives in Sweden's disability policy are to establish a social community based on diversity, a society that is shaped in order to make persons with disabilities of all ages fully involved in civic life and equality in living conditions for girls and boys, women and men with disabilities. However, there are areas in the Swedish disability policy where some challenges and obstacles remain. I will get back to this further on in my presentation. Sweden submitted its first report on the implementation of the Convention to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2011. We had our first dialogue with the committee in April 2014. We found the dialogue with the committee very inspiring and fruitful, and the concluding observations are important contributions to the future development of the Swedish disability policy. The Swedish government is presently preparing a new disability strategy that will follow the present strategy. In our view, the disability policy in Sweden must be founded, among other things, on the Convention. The recommendations from the committee will therefore be considered within this process and be important in the shaping of our future disability strategy. As I said in the beginning, Sweden's new government is a feminist government. Inhibitive gender roles and structures must be combated. Women and men must be given equal power to shape society and their own lives. Gender mainstreaming in disability policy is of great importance for the government. Some of the recommendations from the committee aims at improving awareness rising according to Article 8 of the Convention. To this background, the Swedish government has decided to assign the Swedish Agency for the Participation to launch an information campaign on the rights of persons with disabilities with the purpose to prevent discrimination. The government points out areas of special concerns such as education, employment, and labor market. Furthermore, civil society has an important role in the implementation of the recommendations. Since the assignments will be based on the individual's own experience, we found that it's essential to involve the disabled person's organization. Without the participation, there will be less quality and less relevance in the implementation. As I said in the beginning of my presentation, Sweden has made progress and achievements since the Convention went into force. Let me mention some of them. The Swedish strategy of disability policy is based on the Convention with a coherent structure for follow-up. A new legislation has been decided on lack of reasonable accommodations as a form of discrimination. The legislation concerning support and service for persons with certain functional impairments is rights-based with the aim to fulfill the requirements in Article 19 of the Convention. The Swedish education system is based on the principle of inclusion. But as I point out, we also have challenges ahead of us that we need to address. Attitudes and prejudice are making it difficult for persons with disabilities to enter the labor market. Barriers to people's participation in society must be torn down. Therefore, the new law on lack of reasonable accommodation as a form of discrimination will be reviewed. Gender equality must be further emphasized in disability policy. To create inclusive education for pupils with disabilities is still something that we need to address. Another important question that the government has announced is how the monitoring of the implementation of human rights in Sweden can be secured. To sum up, considerable progress is made to promote the rights of an inclusion inclusion of persons with disabilities in Sweden, but we still have a lot of work and challenges ahead of us. Let us use this conference as an important platform to continue the work to the full enjoyment of rights of persons with disabilities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We'll move on now to Hungary and Mr. Paul Szekeres, the Ministerial Commissioner for Disability.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I have the remote control, very good. I have a short presentation about National Disability Strategy, and because the time is very short, we made the printed version of the full National Disability Program. What you can find on the table on the left side is 20 pages. And is not only a paper now, so we are very happy because the National Assembly approved the program in 7th of April this year, and this program is 10-year-long frame for our work. So I will speak few words about our past. Because I don't know, as you see or not, I'm a guy in a wheelchair. I'm a wheelchair user, and when we have not the law, so before 1998, we don't have accessibility. We don't have special devices. We have that mental blocks, the invisible barriers, and when we had the first act in 1998. We believe in big changes, and the big changes come, but still a lot to do. So it's we made our program, our strategy based on the United Nations conventions, what was ratified in Hungary in 2007, and the program what we made for 10 years is not only approved by the National Assembly, is also approved by the National Disability Council. That council is the participation with all the NGOs in Hungary, with NGOs work in the different kind of disabilities, and we have full support from them. So there was no substantial, no against. All voted for this program. And this program, if you are interested, you can read it all. Is try to find a good frame to our future work, and also we start to make our action plan. And the action plan was presented by for the civil organization just 2 weeks ago, before to send it to the other ministries, so they had the possibility to see just the beginnings and to tell their opinions. So I can tell you, in Hungary we try to work for disabled in a very common way. I have many numbers and details in my papers, but I think it's more important to follow some ideas what I heard before. So the nothing about us without us, I perfectly agree, and that's why from last September we met 3 times with our civil partners, with the state secretary level, and we try to continue work, because we know we can be proud about the strategy, what we have a lot to do, and we want to do more. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We'll turn now to our keynote speakers. I'm sure we'll all benefit from hearing the UN's perspective on implementation of the Convention across the EU member states. So I'm delighted to give the floor to Ms. Catalina Devandas Aguillar, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to participate in this high-level meeting on disability. I would like to congratulate the Latvian presidency for taking this excellent initiative. This conference is an opportunity for the European Union to take a stock of its experience, progress, and challenges faced since it concluded the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This panel discussion also constitutes a great opportunity to reflect together on the next steps required by the European Union to ensure the participation of Europeans with disabilities as equal members of societies in full compliance with the Convention. From the onset, let me share with you that the disability community is very pleased that the innovative character of Article 44 of the CRPD enabled the conclusion of the Convention by the European Union, which is the first regional integration organization ever to join a UN treaty. And this is important because it constitutes a landmark achievement that would certainly strengthen the universal recognition of human rights. The convening of this high-level meeting, as was mentioned before, it's very timely, given that the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has recently adopted the list of issues in relation to the initial report of the European Union and will adopt its concluded observations in the next summer. I'm keen to follow this discussion closely as the subsequent implementation by the European Union of this recommendation. The Union has been a key international supporter in the promotion and advancement of the rights of persons with disabilities. It played a leading role in the negotiation process towards the adoption of the CRPD and has ever since proactively engaged in all international debates following its entry into force. For instance, the European Union was a strong supporter of the process towards the creation of this mandate that I'm representing here today, the first Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities created under the Human Rights Council. I'm very pleased to note that the European Union has also made considerable progress and played a central role to promote and protect the rights of Europeans with disabilities by, for instance, developing instruments and policies such as the European Disability Strategy, the Employment Equality Directive, the new Common Provision Regulation for the European Structural and Investment Funds, and different passenger rights regulation. Also important, as was mentioned before, the Union is in the process of adopting the Equal Treatment Directive and the European Accessibility Act, which are crucial legislation to advance CRPD implementation in the Union. While acknowledging these positive steps, I believe that more efforts are required to ensure the European Union's compliance with fundamental provisions of the CRPD, and that these obligations are translated into practical and concrete measures to be implemented across its member states. In my view, more efforts are required to advance the implementation of the Convention with regards to enjoyment of legal capacity on an equal basis with others and in all aspects of life, liberty of movement and nationality, life independently and included in the community, inclusive education and employment, social protection, and international cooperation. As I won't have the time to elaborate on each of these issues, let me focus on those which, from my perspective, would require your most urgent attention and action. First of all, the right to live independently and be included in the community. Echoing the words of the Commissioner for Human Rights, the European Union funding instruments can be used to promote the participation of persons with disabilities in their communities by, for instance, supporting the transition from institutional to community-based service. However, strong concerns have been raised about the use of the European structural and investment funds for the creation of new residential institutions that further lead to the segregation and social isolation of persons with disabilities. While the European Union has taken positive measures with the adoption of the above-mentioned Regulation 1303 of 2013, which includes a precondition to ensure that the existence of administrative capacity for the implementation and application of the CRPD in the field of the structural funds, more needs to be done to monitor the implementation of the projects and to guarantee the full compliance of the regulation and of Article 19 of the Convention. In other words, you must make sure that no European funding should be used to support the creation of new institutions. In addition, the limitations to freedom of movement of Europeans with disabilities due to the non-transferability of their disability support benefits stand in a stark contrast with those situations in which persons with disabilities are transferred into institutions in neighboring countries due to the lack of support services in their own communities. Also, and strongly related to the right to live independently and included in the community, it is of utmost importance that the European Union combats discrimination of Europeans with disabilities when exercising the legal capacity. This is a sine qua non to guarantee their enjoyment of the full range of the rights or of the rights on an equal basis with others. With regards to education, there is no need to say that inclusion is a key element of quality education for all, and lack of access to regular education will for sure lead to marginalized persons from society as a whole. The European Union is in a privileged position to encourage cooperation among its members and support their actions with regard to inclusive education. The implementation of the obligations resulting from Article 24 of the Convention varies significantly across the Union. Some member states have substantially promoted inclusive education for children and adults with disabilities, while others still operate under systems where segregation and exclusion from regular schools is the rule. Also, in many countries, there is a need to increase access and quality of education for specific groups, such as autistic children. Here, I would like to echo the recommendations recently made at the Day of General Discussion on Education at the CRPD Committee, where experts alerted about the use of evaluation and ranking systems which can lead to the exclusion of children with learning disabilities, including children with disabilities. Alternatively, a system where the quality of inclusive education could be measured and which will guide education policies was suggested. The European Union could take the lead in encouraging the creation of such an alternative ranking system. Last but not least, the European funding instruments can also help support member states to transform its educational systems. In regards to employment, Article 27 of the Convention. In most of the European Union member states, employment rates of persons with disabilities remain very low. Despite the existence of the strong EU legislation, discrimination is widespread. Experts point out that resources are invested mainly in sheltered workshop or in generic vocational training, which fails to provide real entry to the labor market, rather than in supported employment. For instance, placement of persons with disabilities with some support into jobs on the mainstream labor market, which has been shown to be more effective. The way in which disability benefits are being designed has a clear impact on labor market participation of persons with disabilities, as the experience of many European countries shows. More reflection is required to ensure social protection systems that, while providing adequate income for persons with disabilities who cannot work, also adequately cover disability-related extra costs for persons with disabilities who can work. While denial of reasonable accommodation as a form of discrimination is part of the EU legal framework since 2000, it is largely an unknown concept, and more needs to be done to make this important element of anti-discrimination policies really effective. The European Union experience could, in this respect, inspire other countries that have ratified the CRPD and will be faced with similar challenges to its effective implementation. One last point with regard to employment is, and that deserves a lot of attention, is the need for better policies to promote the employment and return to work of people with mental health conditions, as has been highlighted in the conclusions of the recent OECD High-Level Forum on Mental Health and Work. Another point that I want to make is with regards to social protection and the effects of the austerity measures. The European social protection schemes for persons with disabilities have been clearly affected by the fiscal adjustment. Available research shows that persons with disabilities were among those hardest hit by the budget cuts over the last few years. Persons with disabilities benefits were reduced, pensions were reduced, decreases in individual budgets, drastic decrease of funding for community-based services, and significant cuts in inclusive education budgets. Thus, the cuts have reversed some of the gains of the previous periods. Social protection should have been a response to the economic crisis. Without it, the right to live independently and included in the community will never become a reality. The last point that I want to make is with regards to international cooperation. The Union has taken positive steps towards a more inclusive international cooperation. However, a stronger action is needed to fully mainstream the disability rights perspective into the European External Action Aid. In following its obligations under Article 32 of the CRPD, the Union could adopt safeguards and conditionalities to ensure that all its international cooperation efforts are fully inclusive and are not resulting in the creation of new barriers for the participation of persons with disabilities. The post-2015 development agenda represents a window of opportunity to further advance in the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the EU development cooperation efforts. Another area in which the EU can make a significant contribution through its external aid is to ensure that persons with disabilities are fully included in all humanitarian initiatives. Article 11 of the CRPD reminds us that persons with disabilities are particularly high risk in situations of emergency. In my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities, I am mandated to develop a permanent dialogue and to consult with states and others on the realization of the rights of persons with disabilities, including by providing technical assistance and making recommendations on how to better promote international cooperation and the inclusion of persons with disabilities, both as agents and beneficiaries of development processes. It would be very important to be able to count on the support of the European Union to advance the process undergoing in development countries. It will be an immense contribution to the advancement of the disability rights agenda at global level. Before I close, I would like to highlight some clear opportunities for the EU to further advance the implementation of the CRPD, and some of those were already mentioned by Mrs. Cabral this morning. Both the disability strategy and the strategy of Europe 2020 will be revised in 2015. These revisions should be made taking into consideration the recommendations that will be made by the CRPD committee and in consultation with persons with disabilities and the representative organization. I would also like to highlight the opportunity of the European Union to conclude the Marrakech Treaty, greatly advancing the right of blind people to access information and knowledge. In closing, I would also like to stress the relevance of this high-level conference and the need to continue these discussions on how to better advance the implementation of the CRPD in the European context. I look forward to the forthcoming discussions and continue this dialogue beyond this event. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker today will share valuable insights on implementation from a local government perspective. I'm delighted to introduce Mr. João Afonso, representing Eurocities and Lisbon's Deputy Mayor with responsibility for social affairs.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to start by congratulating the Latvian presidency of the Council of the European Union. I do it on behalf of Eurocities, the major European network of cities. This high-level meeting on disability comes at the right time. 5 years ago, the European Union signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is a good point to evaluate how far we've come and to understand how we can go further and faster. Our network includes more than 130 cities. Many of our members are working hard to implement the Convention, and many have been working for disability rights for over a decade. Delivering human rights on a local level is a daily challenge for cities. In part, it's a challenge because we want it to do. We want it to be a part of our mission. Cities aren't made of cars, roads, and buildings. They are made of people, and they must work for people. But it's also a challenge because there is still a lot to be done. Cities know it, because cities are often the first layer of government that comes into contact with the problems that hurt people and threaten their rights. For these reasons, having the opportunity to present our experience, our needs, our commitments, and why not, our dreams on this high-level meeting is both fair and necessary. So, again, thank you for inviting us. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is a major step forward, not only for human rights, but for all of us as a civilization. We sometimes wonder why a civilization that has put a man on the moon has so much difficulty ensuring human rights for all down here on Earth. When setting foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong said, "We was taking a small step for man, but a giant leap for mankind." Well, implementing this convention is a giant leap for mankind, that's for sure. But it implies not one, but many steps. And some of these steps aren't small. We have to work together, and we have to help each other. We must have an integrated approach on all levels of governance, European, national, regional, and local. And this approach must acknowledge that cities are on the front line of this challenge, and have a key role to play in the implementation of the Convention. Cities have to deal with most of the barriers that restrict participation in society, be the late limited accessibility or lack of inclusive labor markets. Cities bear the necessary investments and maintain costs for adaptation of public spaces, public transport, public schools, and many other community facilities. Cities have important obligations in terms of building permits, regulations and legal standards that ensure equal access to goods and service. Cities have a key role in shaping social and employment service for people with disabilities. Look at Brno and Stockholm, for example. Cities have a key role in building inclusive labor markets. This can be done by not only focusing on activation measures of people with disabilities, but also on demand-side interventions, including promoting intermediate labor market policies and working with employers. Look at Gothenburg and Barcelona, for example. Cities can leverage the power of public procurement to improve integration of people with disabilities into the labor market. Look at Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Rennes Metropole, and Ljubljana, for example. Cities, finally, are strategically positioned to strongly align interventions to local realities and people's needs, to create partnerships with a range of stakeholders, and to promote dialogue and participation. So, we, cities, deliver rights on a local level. It's what we do. It's what we want to do. And we want to do it more for it. And we want to do more for it, of it. We have a strategic role to play. We should always be involved as partners when relevant national and European regulations and funding programs are shaped and agreed. Eurocities has highlighted the need to consult local authorities when taking decisions on spending priorities for the European structural and investment funds, including the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund. Cities are a specific layer of European governance. We have to right to representation in the shaping of European policies and instruments. And it must be recognized that national governments do not necessarily represent all of the city's views, especially in matters where cities already are in the need of support from their national authorities. We know we are gathered today to talk about the rights of persons with disabilities, not about the rights of cities. But we insist on this point for one reason, one reason only. Cities are one of the best available tools to further the rights of persons with disabilities. Allow me to refer to Lisbon, my city, for 3 quick examples. We've been working on disability rights for over 2 decades. Most of this work has been done in close cooperation with the disability community. Take, for example, the Open House program. It was started as early as 1991 and has been ever since adapting the homes of persons with motor disabilities, mainly wheelchair users. The community had the idea and participated in its implementation and management, long before our central government did anything about it. Another example is our pedestrian accessibility plan. The plan sets the city strategy to promote accessibility in these public spaces, its public buildings, and its public transport network. This strategic plan also addressed the way the city conducts its private building oversight, or promotes accessible tourism, or organize the electoral process, special choice of polling places. The disability community participates throughout the whole planning process and is now monitoring closely the implementation of the plan, continuously helping us establish priorities and deliver new solutions. Many of these solutions go beyond national legal standards. My fourth and last example is our pilot project for independent living. the disability community has been fighting for the creation of a national independent living system. This fight has involved various forms of protest, including a hunger strike and a 180-kilometer march in an electric wheelchair. The two basic tenets of this independent living system, personal assistance and direct payments, run contrary to decades-old national policies. This policy offer few choices other than institutionalization or a very small subsidy counting on the family and to ensure assistance. This system is a complete paradigm shift in terms of disability policies. Thinking about its implementation on a national level is a daunting task, but it's necessary. Showing change is possible, even in a small scale, is of paramount importance. So, the community has created its independent living center, and after summer we'll move forward together with the pilot project. These examples from Lisbon are matched by many other examples in many other European cities. They all have one thing in common. The city was one step ahead of its national government, or many steps ahead for that matter. Why? Because delivering human rights on a local level implies necessarily close cooperation with the community. And we are happy and proud to point out that this close cooperation has been the source and the driving force of much innovation and enthusiasm. Community, cooperation, innovation, enthusiasm. These are key words for promoting inclusive education and inclusive employment. Opening up schools to children with disabilities must be a priority, but enrollment is not enough. We must make sure that school buildings are accessible, the educational practices are adequate, the teachers and school staff are prepared, and the school culture becomes more inclusive. Many cities have, for the past decades, been doing a silent but continuous work to better integrate schools, and they do it involving the community with enthusiasm. On employment, a good example is the innovative way some cities leverage the power of public procurement to create inclusive labor markets with the cooperation of major employers. Amsterdam and Rotterdam use a social return clause in public procurement. It requires private contractors to reinvest part of the profit from contracts with the city to create employment, training or work experience placements for people with disability. Rennes Metropole set up partnership with social enterprise by requiring that companies who bid on city tenders create social inclusion programs within service delivery. For instance, back-to-work programs for people with disability. These great examples could only emerge on local level. We want to continue this dialogue. Like we said, there is a lot to be done. Accessibility is indispensable for disability becoming an everyday reality on the ground. So, accessibility must be a cornerstone in European disability policy. We will hold a European conference dedicated to this topic in June in Lisbon. We hope to see you there. So, let's move forward on a local level together. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for that. Our final speaker brings us the benefit of considerable expertise in the area of disability issues and policy development. So please welcome Mr. Mark Priestley, the Scientific Director of the Academic Network of European Disability Experts. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. And thank you to the Chair and to the Presidency, the Latvian Presidency, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm speaking as the scientific director of the academic network, the Commission's academic network. So we are independent. We have no vested interest. And speaking last is always sometimes a challenge, sometimes a privilege. At least you know what everyone has already said. So I'm going to say a lot of things which are very similar, which is a relief, I have to say. It's not always the case. So just very briefly, ARNED, the Academic Network of European Disability Experts, is an expert network of the Commission. It was contracted from the end of 2007 for 4 years, followed by another 3 years, and I'm delighted to say that we should be able to announce a new work programme for the coming years. But I'm going to talk about the past work. And really the network is there to try to input information, evidence, research evidence from the different countries, not only of the European member states, but also of the associated countries and the candidate countries. So we work we have been working in 34 countries, which will become 35 with Montenegro. We also try to create a public knowledge resource. Knowledge is not always easy to come by. In some countries, it's much easier to obtain than others. And really, my big request to you is to put your knowledge out there, to make it available to researchers, to fund research studies, to make sure that data is available. But we try to provide a public online resource, including the disability online tool of the Commission, the .com database, where we try to track policy developments across all of the countries. And we welcome your input to that. We also develop statistical indicators, and we produce themed reports. So enough about us. Over the past few years, we've been working in a number of strands. Accessibility has been a huge priority for the European Union, as Catalina mentioned, but also the development of statistical indicators, and we very much welcome the work that Eurostat is now doing on that. But looking at EU law and policy, as well as looking at national disability policies. So I'm very thankful to my colleagues for their input on that. So, what to do? Progress. In 2011, many of us who are here today met under the Hungarian presidency in Budapest for a high-level meeting on disability, and to look at the agenda was on the challenges of the European disability strategy. So I thought I would look back since 2011 at the last meeting and see perhaps if we had made any progress. Data is always difficult, so the data we have, the most recent data, was from 2012. At that meeting, I showed some differences between countries, and which countries were doing well and which countries were not. So for diplomatic reasons, I won't do that today. But let's look at the EU average. So I have a chart here. Please don't worry about the numbers. They would be too small to see. But the patterns are really important. And they underline what Maria Cabral from the Commission said in her introduction. If we look at European strategy on employment, we see that there's a headline target of 75% employment across the European Union. And really, we're not going to meet that target unless we also tackle the employment situation of disabled people. This is not just a disability issue, it's about actually meeting the high-level targets that we've set ourselves across the European Union. And on my graph, I have a number of columns. And you might guess what they are, but I'll tell you. The first column is a tall blue column, and it represents the employment rate of people who tell us that they don't have any kind of long-term health condition or impairment condition that affects their daily activity. And it's quite high. Their employment rate is about 70% or thereabouts. The next column is another blue column, and it's a little bit shorter. It's quite a bit shorter. That's the employment rate of people who tell us that they have an impairment or a health condition that has a moderate effect on their daily living. And the third column is a very small blue column, and that's the employment rate of people who tell us that they have an impairment that has a severe effect on their daily activities. And so you can see there's a huge difference, and particularly for people with more severe levels of impairment. The representative from Sweden gave us the important message about the interaction of disability and gender equality. And the remaining columns on my graph are just by disability and gender. So the smallest employment level is for disabled women, followed by disabled men, it's higher for non-disabled women and higher again for non-disabled men. And so we continually see this interaction of gender equality and disability equality. And these are average figures for the European Union. And that pattern holds for almost every country that's represented in their room. There are one or two examples where gender equality is much better than this. I won't name names, but you can see me afterwards and I'll show you the graph. Okay, here's another graph. I'll talk you through this. We were talking about children and young people and education, and was mentioned in the opening about early leavers from education. So if we look again at the EU 2020 headline strategy targets, we want to reduce the number of young people who are leaving education early. Well, in this graph, I have a rather large red bar which shows the proportion of young people with an impairment or long-term health condition who are also early leavers from education. And a rather small bar next to it which represents those who do not have an impairment. So immediately we can see that the risk of leaving education early is much higher. Statistics are difficult, it's a small age group, so even taking a larger age group, it's exactly the same pattern. I have a second graph which is about achievement of third level education by the time people get into their age of their 30s, another EU 2020 headline. And here we see the opposite. It's not surprising, you've seen the patterns. So the small red bar is the likelihood of having achieved a third level education qualification by the time you're in your 30s. If you're a disabled person, the larger blue bar is if you're not. So across all of these targets in education, in employment, we see those inequalities being reproduced in country after country. And I think it's a huge responsibility of the member states to be able to know what that situation is in your country. I'll say later the problem we have, we can't even be sure of the data in many countries. So I'll just take one more. Unsurprisingly, it's about the risk of poverty and social exclusion. So I'm following the EU 2020 headline indicators. And it's the same picture. The risk of living in a household, in a family, that experiences poverty and social exclusion is far, far greater if you're a person living with a long-term health condition or an impairment. And part of that is to do with an aging profile, but actually the inequalities and poverty are greater for disabled people of working age than they are for older people. The levels of social protection for older people in most of the EU member states give a certain level of protection to pensioners who may also have earned contributions during their lifetimes. But young people with severe levels of impairment of working age are at high risk of poverty. And again, there is a slight gender difference. Women are at greater risk. So that's the situation overall. Progress. So I thought, forgive me if any of these are inaccurate, but I thought I would just go back to the database since the meeting in Budapest and see if anybody had changed anything. Unfortunately, there are some examples. I could draw your attention also to the paper which is being launched by the Agency for Fundamental Rights at this meeting, which gives more extensive examples of laws that have been changed in support of the Convention. So we've already seen that the EU and all but 3 of its member states have so far concluded, ratified the CRPD, and there is progress towards that. We've seen updates of legal capacity legislation, as was mentioned in Ireland, the big discussion there. The recognition of Danish Sign Language, I noticed the extension of voting rights for disabled people. But we've also, perhaps more generally than that, seen new national disability strategies. We've seen new CRPD implementation programs. So we have seen some initiatives. We've seen some attention to accessibility. Just to take some examples in the north and the east of Europe, neighbours, the inclusion of accessibility for disabled people within the Information Society Development Plan in Estonia. It's about disability mainstreaming, bringing disability equality into mainstream initiatives. In Latvia, we've also seen the inclusion of some accessibility initiatives, transport measures. We see some changes in education in some countries, but I would have to say we don't see as many changes in education as we do in some other areas of policy. We see some improvements in the quality and the monitoring of social services in a number of countries. But we also see abuses of those rights in institutions and in a lack of support for community services. And as Mr. Afonso said, we live in a world of multi-level governance. We have a global framework of rights. We have an EU strategy, national policies, but implementation and realities for disabled people. Most disabled people live their lives locally, and those are often where the real challenges are. We've seen some improvements in data, really welcome from the Eurostat, the new website on disability statistics, the release of the labour force survey ad hoc module, and a new database which is now developing on disability indicators. We very much welcome that. There have been examples, say the Estonian statistical programme developed a special bulletin on the integration of disabled persons with indicators, really nice example. The project group in Denmark has been meeting to look at indicators and so on. But it's not all good news, and these messages have already been stated, I think, in the opening section and also in Catalina's presentation. There are some real risks that we have seen since we met in Budapest in 2011. The things that have really worried us have been the reduced eligibility to disability-related social protection. Partly as a consequence of fiscal consolidation and austerity, but there has been a real targeting of disabled people with tighter assessments based more on medical and more on functional criteria rather than on rights-based criteria. And we've also seen that the idea of that is to make more people available for work, to encourage and support disabled people into the labour force, which obviously we encourage. But that has not been matched by the kind of structural investments, social investments in making the workplace accessible, making sure that there are supports in the workplace to enable disabled people to work. So it's rather been a reduction of social protection for those out of work rather than investments in work. And really we need to see more examples coming forward of social investments in accessibility in the workplace and workplace support. At the local level, one of the things we've seen has been the effect on local services. Cuts in public support services, some countries were mentioned earlier, which have really affected support at the local level, whether that's social workers or public employment service advisors, whether it's assistance and support in the classroom, whether it's investment in making public buildings accessible. We've seen programs have been slowed down or stopped. We've seen huge effects on local charities, local disabled people's organisations being unable to continue their support. And those things are really felt by people at the local level in the city, even if they're not city policies. They're felt at a local level. But they're often very difficult for us to monitor, to see those effects. And so we rely very much on the stories coming forward from disabled people's organisations and campaigns highlighting those examples. One of the things that this points to us is that what we really need is solutions that are joined up between the global, the European, the national and the local, but also solutions that are joined up between different sectors. If we have a disability strategy, then it needs to be a cross-sectoral disability strategy. Actually, Ireland is interesting in that example of having those sectoral plans. We see the development of national disability strategies in almost every member state, but what we don't see is a linkage between those strategies and EU 2020, for example. So you could look at your national reform programme in your country. Does it mention the CRPD? Does it mention the National Disability Strategy? It is amazing how many countries that's not the case. So joining up those strategic initiatives is really, really important. And along with that, we often are frustrated by the lack of data and monitoring. We need new kinds of data, new kinds of surveys, new kinds of evidence in order to monitor the rights that Catalina was talking about. Not only employment outcomes for disabled people, but can you tell me what proportion of buses are wheelchair accessible, for example? Is there any way of measuring those things? And we need to see the involvement of disabled people's organisations in policy dialogue and participation. Again, I would hope that the next time we meet under the next presidency that each delegation would have the voice of disabled people's organisations present within the delegation. That's great to see from Italy and from other countries. So, just a few key points to finish up. As academics, we would love more data. We love data. But we would love to see member states including disability evidence in all of their major surveys and data sets. Again, there have been great examples in Ireland in the past. But the fact that in the majority of member states would not be able to give us a regular statistic on the employment rate of disabled people from their National Labour Force survey because disabled people are not identified within it. Why is that? Is there data on the education and poverty of children and young people, or on the number of people who are living in institutions who are not represented within household surveys? And could you help us to update the information we hold about your country in .com? We'd welcome your help. So, final messages. The policies and outcomes between the different member states vary a lot. There is some harmonisation, but there is a lot of variety. For many, many different reasons. The levels of social protection vary quite considerably, as Catalina has mentioned. And there is some association between the equality gaps for disabled people and the levels of social protection that's available in different countries. More work is needed on that, but that association does exist. Some of the policy responses that we have seen during the economic crisis have created risks. In times of austerity, disabled people, particularly those of working age, younger adults, have been targeted for reduced eligibility to social protection, to local services. We need to monitor the impact and the equality impact of those changes, particularly for people with more severe impairments, particularly for people whose conditions fluctuate, particularly for people with mental health conditions. But in terms of the conference focus also on younger people, we have to remember that the effects of disability and discrimination are cumulative across the life course. So whilst the larger share of people with long-term impairments in Europe acquire them later in life, they're older workers or pensioners, that shouldn't hide the fact that there are real inequalities in all age groups, but the risks for young people are very considerable. Exclusion from education, living in a poor household, the risk of poverty and social exclusion, growing up with that, moving into a low employment chance, have a cumulative effect then on contributions to social protection benefit, to old age pensions, and throughout the life course we see there's a multiplication of that risk. So anything we can do early has payback. We should remember that disabled young people who leave education are twice as likely to go into economic activity than they are to go into a job. And that's a very stark statistic. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to all of our panellists who've given us an awful lot to think about. Now it's your turn. I'm told we have about 20 minutes or so for discussion, for questions. We'll take questions a few at a time. It would be very useful if you could just either state your name or your country or your organisation at the start. So the floor is open.
Dear colleagues, dear participants, I'm Iva Prpić, Assistant Minister from Croatia, Ministry of Social Policy and Youth. Excuse me for being in my coat, but in Zagreb it's 32 degrees and we are having, so we are accommodating. I would like to inform you on something what is happening in European Parliament, and I think that all of you could participate in this declaration. I was at in December 2014 on a meeting which was held by the European Expert Group on the transition from institutional to community-based care. After that meeting, a few of MPs, members of the European Parliament, held by Biljana Borzan from Croatia, has written a declaration about deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities. I must say that I am pretty disappointed because by the procedure you must collect half of the signatures of all the MPs of the MPs European Parliament. We have time till 25 of June to collect about 400 signatures. Now we have 100. So I think it's historical that for the first time members of the European Parliament take a really political strong stand about what we want to aim, what our goal is as Europe and as European citizens. So this discussion goes in a way to ask for all of European parliaments. As a Croatia, we have a small amount of Croatian MPs, but all of you who are bigger, older members of the European Union, I think it's a small step for you, but a big step for all of people with disabilities, children with disabilities who are held right now in institutions, segregated, and not having a chance for community-based services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Dimitris Nikolski from Greece. Okay, to be honest, talking about what has been done so far regarding the UN Convention, in reality, it could be a huge discussion, maybe more than 2 days than this current conference. A little bit make it more concrete regarding the employment, and I will have just a straight question to nice Professor Priestley. Maybe we have discussed this in the past, but it would be quite interesting to give us a response just maybe now. You talked that there is a lack of data and statistics in countries, and as you know, there is a discussion that is running now this period in EU members regarding the indicators and how could develop concrete and secure indicators in order to have a clear view of what has been done regarding the implementation of each article of the UN Convention. So my question is if you think that is an easy way to create indicators when there is, let's say, even a problematic situation for defining the disability among member states. So that's my straight question to Professor. Thank you.
Does anyone else have a similar question on that topic? If you'd like Mr. Priestley to address them all together? No? Mark, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you to Greece for that observation. It's a very well-known discussion. Yes, there is a difficulty in collecting data. And I suppose the task that we set ourselves some years ago was to try to produce examples of what could be done with the data which we currently have from European surveys. So, for example, using the social excuse me, the EU Silk data, and we know there are huge difficulties with that. If you ask people in different countries, in different languages, whether they feel that they have a long-term health condition or impairment which limits their daily activities, you get different responses. And people of different ages respond differently in different countries. We know that. So there is a large variation on that. There's less variation if you look at for example, at people who say that they have a severe restriction on certain aspects of their daily life. There is not so much variation on that. Or for example, if you look at the proportion of people in receipt of disability-related benefits, and you can make correlations between different data sets, and you can establish still very clear patterns. I mean, my challenge to you is if anybody doesn't like how their country looks in the statistics that we publish, we'd love to see a better version. If you have data in your own country which would help us to contextualize that or to contest it, we would love to see that. But certainly data harmonization, Eurostat, the Washington group at the UN has been working really hard to try and understand how we can improve that comparability. But I would say that irrespective of the precise numbers, and that's why I didn't show precise numbers, irrespective of the precise numbers, the patterns are the same in every single member state, with the exception of some gender equality differences. So I think the patterns are pretty robust.
Thank you. Sorry, Italy, would you like the floor?
I am Giampiero Griffo from Italian Forum on Disability. I make a consideration and two questions. The first consideration is segregation was for centuries the solution for persons with disability. This means that in Europe we have yet 1,200,000 persons with disability in institutions, and about 60% of pupils with disability go in a special classes, school or classes in Europe. This means the gap that persons with disability living in consideration of the convention are very high. And maybe, because you know the famous book of Hannah Arendt on the banality of the evil, maybe I think that say this morning the Human Rights Commissioner on the situation in institution, we need to investigate the banality of the evil in institutions because they are very strong. But my questions are direct from Catalina. Because this gap, the convention stressed that the objective is the inclusion. But the system in all parts of the world are based on the idea of the protection. This means when happen the crisis, as we have a look in all parts of the world, we are, as in the Evangelium, the last to receive, the first to be cut. This means that the policy related to persons with disability are the policy of the surplus money. And that is not exactly the say the convention. What do you think? Because we're speaking in different areas, we want a welfare of social inclusion. This means to overcoming the gap. The second question is to the Lady Cabral. The transference of the competence in the Euro DG from justice to employment produce a perception not very good, because I listen in different conferences that now all people stress about the economical, social, and cultural rights and not about the human rights. And that is not very good, because exactly the convention are based on human rights. So my question is, as in a different context, the unit of disability respect the human right approach and include in the social affair the human right approach. Because if you have the 15% of population in the world, we no benefit of the 15% of the money of the policy. But if we think that we are the 100% of population during the life, maybe the policy related to disability need to move from the specific policy to general policy, but based on human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Catalina, would you like to?
Thank you very much, Giampiero. I do agree with you that we have to see the Convention as an opportunity to mainstream the rights of persons with disabilities through all, and see it as a general obligation of the states to promote participation, active participation of persons with disabilities. And that is of relevance, especially when we're talking about social protection. And social protection should be a tool for social participation, and that considers not only the minimal support to have dignity, but also social protection. If we want to implement what the Convention says in Article 19, social protection should also cover disability-related expenses that doesn't allow for the participation of persons with disabilities. And I think that it's quite important in the European Union, where you have had those mechanisms already. Some of the countries have them, and this could be extended to the rest of the countries. But for sure, the additional costs related to having a disability should be tackled and taken into consideration when you're talking about social protection, if your final aim is to aim for participation of persons with disabilities. And I think that the implications of this cost, the cuts and the budgets now to social protection have resulted in further exclusion of persons with disabilities, and going back to thinking that the solution of institutionalization or segregation is cheaper than the participation. And I truly believe that it's the contrary. As Mark was saying, investing in inclusion from early stages is the only thing that it's going to render the fruit that we want. It's not about if we can afford the costs of social protection, but I think is that we cannot afford the costs of not including persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Now, I don't know if Ms. Cabral or someone from the Commission is here would like to address your point. I'm representing Ireland, so I wouldn't dare. I've been told we have 2 to 3 minutes left for the discussion, but if I notice Malta are keen to intervene, would you like to dive in quickly within the 3 minutes?
So thank you. I think we all concur that from words we have to pass to action, and that's what Malta is doing. In fact, for the first time ever, we have a parliamentary secretariat dedicated to rights of persons with disability. This is an equivalent of a junior ministry with a separate portfolio, and despite the crisis, we did not effect cuts, but we increased our budget, because our commitment to the sector and human rights obviously has to be tangibly expressed. We are addressing disability issues in the following ways. Firstly, by keeping in close proximity with the grassroots, and we are involving persons with disability, their families, and also NGOs, and we are treating them as protagonists rather than persons we consult with, but we invite them to come forward with their proposals, and so as government to take them on board. We are also creating a legal identity to our service provision, and we are securing social benefits together with the strengthening of the legislative framework. We are also working hard to provide an array of residential units in the form of small community homes housing less than 10 residents in each home. And we are also improving and diversifying our community services so as to be tailor-made for the individual. And also in this regard, we are committed to provide the empirical research by setting the national database, and for this we also obtained EU funding. And we are also offering nationwide training for all layers of service providers, from the frontliners to managers and directors, so as to ensure quality service provision. And with regards to that, we also benefited from ESF funding. With regards to inclusive education, in many ways, this sector in Malta is a success story. In fact, over these last year, we provided a great deal of resources and dedication, and we have invested in the development of professionals and also infrastructure. With regards to employment, we are revamping our employment laws, and we are focusing on up-to-date policies and strategies, and our employment agency is taking cognizance of the responsibilization of employees. And during the last month, we witnessed a very positive improvement of over 20% of persons with disability registering for work, finding jobs, and more employers are looking more positively towards the sector. Apart from this, obviously the rights agenda depends on strong legislation, and we have embarked in a legislative process where we have an array of new legislations. The first and foremost and more important is the representation of persons with disability on various decision-making bodies, obviously where decisions are taken so that persons with disability are on the forefront. Obviously, at the same time, we have a national policy for persons with disability and also a strategy designed to respond to this policy. I am mentioning these things so that maybe Professor Priestley take notice of this leap forward, and maybe during your next presentation you take also, while you are presenting the improvements in other countries, you mention ours as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we're out of time. I hope you all learned as much as I did. Thank you very much to all the panelists and all the participants. It's coffee break time. I believe we have to be back here at 4:30. Sorry, my watch is still on Irish time. If you could be back in your seats by 4:30, please, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.